When I first thought I might be non-binary, I experienced a lot of self-doubt, especially coming out in my 20s when I was already pretty established in my life. I had a long-term relationship, I was already starting my career. I just didn't really believe that something so fundamental about myself could be different than the way I had seen myself for all those years of my life. The thought that would go through my head often is, if I'm actually non-binary, why didn't I know that sooner? Like, why couldn't I tell that the foundation of my identity was not correct? I came out of my mid-20s and it was a long journey of discovery, because as I started to rewind my life, to replay moments in my head, I realized that so many of the things I felt and experienced when I was younger were actually signs that I was gender non-conforming. I just didn't have the words or ideas to catch on to that. And from all the non-binary and trans people I have talked to, it is a very common experience to look back on certain memories or feelings and realize that those were early signs of your true gender identity before you started to consider that you might not be cis. So here are 5 childhood signs that you might be non-binary or trans. Now, before we get into the list, I do have a couple of caveats. First, these are just my own personal experiences. These are the moments I look back on to realize, yeah, there was something going on when I was a kid, I just didn't realize it. But even if you didn't have these experiences, it doesn't mean you're not non-binary or trans. And vice versa. If you have any or all of these experiences, you can still absolutely be cisgender. This list is also not exhaustive. There are plenty of trans and non-binary people who had different experiences growing up that were clear signs of their identity. If you watch this video and you're like, oh, I had a different experience that's not listed here, tell me about it. I would love to hear more about the experiences that helped you understand who you are. So with that said, let's talk about my childhood. One experience I've heard is very, very common for trans people is playing as a different gender than the one that typically aligns with your sex assigned at birth in video games. And it makes sense, right? Like, video games are kind of an escape from reality. They're this other world where we suspend our disbelief of who we actually are and what we can actually do to interact with this virtual world. You kind of have the freedom to be whoever you want to be. I grew up in an almost exclusively Nintendo household. We got a GameCube, and then we got a Wii, and we got a Switch, and we had a Wii U even somewhere in there. One of the games I played the most was Super Smash Bros., starting with Brawl, and then the 3DS version. And on the 3DS one, my main was Palutena, and my backup was Zelda. And as is very common for a lot of these experiences, I just told myself that it was because I preferred their playstyle. Like, I didn't think too much about the choice I was making, but subconsciously I always made that choice to go for female characters as my first pick. And I was pretty much just always drawn to the girl characters in almost any media I consumed. I used to be a huge fan of Naruto, and Sakura was always my favorite character. Again, didn't think too much of it. Just thought I had certain preferences. And on the thread of preferences, I always had a preference for female-fronted bands. My music tastes evolved a lot over the years, but there were always tended to be undercurrents of rock music. And I also had this phase where I was really into learning Japanese in high school, and it's still something I come back to because I am interested in language. And at the time, I started to listen to a lot of Japanese music, particularly Japanese rock. And one of the bands that I became obsessed with was this girl group called Scandal. And I spent hours upon hours over those years watching concert videos and downloading albums from definitely legal sources. From there, I did kind of get into K-pop for a little bit, and I also had a similar obsession with the band 2NE1. And closer to home, my favorite bands when I really started to explore my music taste were Paramore and Avril Lavigne. I would say like punk rock or pop punk is kind of the longest running music interest I have, and I always just preferred female fronted bands, and I just didn't think too much of it. I always just thought to myself, I just have preferences. It never really crossed my mind that it was weird to be so obsessed with only female fronted or all female bands and just like really follow them that closely. I think one of the big things that I missed out on coming out in my 20s and not earlier in life was experimentation. It is just a lot easier to experiment when you are younger. You have less responsibility, less social pressure, less people who have known you for a long time and have expectations around who you are. And it just becomes a lot harder to start to experiment, whether it's with your preferences or your appearance as you get older. Doesn't mean you can't do it. I am actively in experimentation phases right now, but it does get a lot harder. But I did find some ways to experiment as a kid, even though I did not know that I was non-binary. And one was playing with opposite gender toys. As someone who's a fairly new parent and has kids myself, I think it's kind of crazy how gendered the world of parenting is. We get so obsessive dividing things between girls and boys and forming girls to like pink and hearts and flowers and cats, and boys to like sports and superheroes and blue. And so when I was a kid, I was not afraid to go down the pink girls aisle. And my parents, to their credit, were totally on board with letting me go down and pick out My Little Ponies, or I remember having some Polly Pocket figures. And as I got older, I did understand there was like some weirdness around showing these toys to my friends. But that was one very early way that I started to experiment with breaking gender norms in a way that I didn't even realize or process until I got much older. And in true non-binary fashion, I was really into both extremes. Like, I had Pirates of the Caribbean action figures and Star Wars toys and Bionicles that I loved to just like play action hero type things with. And then I had my Little Pony that I like to play dress up with. A lot of the process of growing up and finding yourself is experimentation. It's trying out different things until you find what feels right. And that can be true with the video games you play, the music you listen to, the toys that you play with, but it's also true of your own self. Experimentation with the way you look and the way you act. I experimented with my appearance when I was young before I learned things like shame and social expectations, and then kind of came back to those same experimentations a lot later in my life. When I was a kid, I loved to wear fake jewelry. For some reason, I had this jewelry making set. I have no idea where it came from, but it had a bunch of little accessories and like wire and clips so I could make clip-on earrings. When I was into Pirates of the Caribbean, I had this glittery skull ring that I wore pretty much all the time. And as I got like into my high school years, I kind of thought it would be cool to grow my hair out, and I didn't do it then, but when I got into college, I did grow my hair out for a while, and then I cut it, and then I grew it out again even longer when I was in my early 20s. And through all that experimentation, what I often found was that I just liked more feminine presentation. A very distinct experience I had was around like the skinny jeans and tight outfits that the singers and the fans used to wear. And I always wanted to wear just like those really tight skinny jeans, but for some reason I was just always insecure about how I would look in them. So I never actually wore them. There's always just this interest in like appearing more feminine that I experimented with when I was young, but ultimately was just too afraid to really pursue. One of the most special things about kids, in my opinion, is their imagination, their ability to not only be like fully present and engaged in the moment or whatever it is they're doing, but also their ability to see the world or imagine the world in ways that are so novel and unique from what is actually there. Just thinking about like what your imagination was when you were a kid can often help you understand your true desires and like what you actually feel inside. At least that was the case for me. Like, I used to mentally role play a lot and just like imagine I was different people, which I think is pretty common for kids. There were times when I was young too where I would just imagine like waking up as a girl one day, like very vividly when I woke up, what it would feel like to have long hair and like what I would look like, how I would look differently in the mirror, because I think I always found it hard to relate to boys and to like the hyper masculine culture that I was in, particularly with how involved I was in sports. So those are just some of my experiences with gender as a kid, as someone who realized they were non-binary a little bit later in life in my 20s. But if you're trans or non-binary, I would love to hear the childhood experiences that either helped you understand your identity or that made more sense when you looked back on them after you realized your identity. And as always, thanks for watching.